Hakan Ayik was one of Australia's most wanted fugitives before his name became linked to Operation Ironside, a major international police operation involving the encrypted app ANOM. Ayik, a Sydney man, had been wanted by Australian authorities over serious drug allegations. Media reports also described him as being linked to the Comanchero bikie environment. For years, he remained outside Australia. Reporting placed him overseas, including in Türkiye, where he was later arrested. In June 2021, Australian authorities announced the results of Operation Ironside. The operation involved ANOM, an encrypted messaging app used by alleged criminal networks. Users believed the app was secure. Police said the platform was secretly controlled by law enforcement. According to the Australian Federal Police, messages sent through ANOM allowed investigators to identify alleged criminal activity, including drug trafficking, money laundering, weapons offenses, and planned violence. The operation led to hundreds of arrests in Australia and overseas. It also resulted in seizures of drugs, firearms, cash, and other assets. Ayik's name became central to the public reporting because police said he had unknowingly helped distribute ANOM among criminal contacts. ABC News reported that authorities said Ayik inadvertently assisted the operation by encouraging people in the underworld to trust and use the app. Police did not describe him as a cooperating witness. The allegation was that he believed the app was secure and promoted it within criminal circles. That detail changed the public understanding of the case. Ayik was wanted by Australian police, but police said his reputation helped ANOM spread among alleged criminal users. Messages sent through the app were later used by investigators to identify people, shipments, payments, and criminal plans. In November 2023, Turkish authorities arrested Ayik in Istanbul as part of an operation targeting an alleged international organized crime group. ABC News reported that 37 people were arrested. Turkish officials alleged the group was involved in drug trafficking, money laundering, and other serious offenses. By 2025, ABC reported that Ayik remained in custody in Türkiye. The report stated that he could face a long prison sentence there, while questions remained about whether he would ever be extradited to Australia. The extradition issue is important. A person can be wanted by Australian authorities but still remain outside Australia if another country's laws prevent or limit extradition. In Ayik's case, reporting has focused on Türkiye's legal position and the fact that he may face prosecution there instead of being returned to Australia. This report examines 4 issues. First, who Hakan Ayik was before Operation Ironside. Second, how ANOM was used by law enforcement. Third, why police said Ayik played an unintended role in the app's spread. Fourth, what his arrest in Türkiye means for Australian organized crime investigations. The case involves drug allegations, bikie-linked reporting, encrypted communications, international policing, and extradition questions. It also shows how organized crime investigations have changed. Police are no longer only relying on surveillance, informants, or physical seizures. In this case, the communication platform itself became part of the investigation. Before going further, subscribe to the channel for more fact-based True Crime Australia reports. Hakan Ayik is an Australian man wanted in New South Wales over alleged large commercial drug supply. He was born on 31 January 1979. He is of Turkish background and grew up in Sydney. Public reporting has connected his early life to the city's southern suburbs. Ayik later became known to police through organized crime investigations. His name appeared in connection with drug supply allegations and criminal networks operating across Australia and overseas. He has been described in Australian media as being linked to the Comanchero bikie environment. That description should be treated as a reported link, not as a finding on every allegation connected to him. Ayik has also been known by the nickname Big Hucks. Some media reports referred to him as the Facebook gangster after images of his lifestyle appeared online while he was outside Australia. New South Wales police listed him as wanted over the alleged supply of large commercial quantities of prohibited drugs. His police profile described him as about 175 to 180 centimeters tall, with black hair, brown eyes, and tattoos on his right arm and chest. For years, Ayik remained outside Australia. His location became a major issue for law enforcement. A person wanted in Australia cannot simply be arrested overseas by Australian police. Authorities must rely on cooperation from foreign governments, local police, and extradition laws. Ayik was widely reported to be living in Türkiye. While overseas, he remained one of the most recognizable Australian fugitives connected to organized crime reporting. His public profile increased sharply in 2021, when Operation Ironside became public. Police said Ayik had unknowingly helped the encrypted app ANOM gain trust among alleged criminal users. He was not described as a police informer. The allegation was that he believed the app was secure and helped promote it within criminal circles. That claim placed his name at the center of one of the largest police stings involving organized crime communications. In November 2023, Turkish authorities arrested Ayik in Istanbul during an operation targeting an alleged international organized crime group. Dozens of people were detained. Turkish officials accused the group of involvement in drug trafficking, money laundering, and other serious offenses. By 2025, Ayik remained in custody in Türkiye. Reporting indicated that he could face a lengthy sentence there. Questions also remained about whether he would ever be extradited to Australia. Ayik's profile is built around several separate elements. A Sydney background, serious drug supply allegations, reported Comanchero links, years outside Australia, the ANOM operation, and his later arrest in Türkiye. Those elements made him one of the most watched Australian crime figures of the past decade. Hakan Ayik's case moved beyond Australia because he was no longer within reach of local law enforcement. He had been linked to Sydney's organised crime environment and was wanted in New South Wales over alleged large commercial drug supply. Once he left Australia, the case became more difficult for police. A fugitive outside the country creates a different legal problem. Australian police can issue warrants, share intelligence, and work with international partners, but they cannot make an arrest in another country without local authorities. Ayik was reported to have lived overseas for years. Türkiye became the main country linked to his fugitive status. His Turkish background was relevant because it gave him a connection outside Australia. It also raised later questions about citizenship, extradition, and whether he could be returned to face proceedings in New South Wales. While outside Australia, Ayik remained a public target for law enforcement. He was not only wanted on paper, his name continued to appear in Australian organised crime reporting, especially in relation to drug trafficking allegations and transnational criminal networks. This changed how the case was viewed. It was no longer only a Sydney drug investigation. It became a fugitive case involving foreign territory, international cooperation, and legal limits on extradition. Ayik was also reported to have built a life overseas. Some media reports described him as living in Türkiye and maintaining a visible public profile online. Images linked to him showed an expensive lifestyle, which led some outlets to refer to him as the Facebook gangster. That public image increased attention around the case. It also created pressure on Australian authorities because a wanted man appeared to be living openly outside the country. For police, the challenge was not only finding him, it was finding a legal path to bring him back. Extradition depends on the law of the country where the person is located. It also depends on citizenship, treaty arrangements, local charges, and whether the foreign country agrees to surrender the person. In Ayik's case, the return path was never simple. Türkiye became more than a place where he was believed to be living. It became the country that would later detain him and consider its own allegations against him. That meant Australian authorities were not the only ones with an interest in the case. By the time Operation Ironside became public in 2021, Ayik was already established in reporting as a fugitive overseas. His name then became tied to ANOM, the encrypted messaging app secretly controlled by law enforcement. Police said he helped spread the app without knowing it was compromised. That allegation gave the case a new dimension. Ayik was wanted by police, but police also said his reputation helped lead other alleged criminal users onto a platform investigators could monitor. This did not bring him back to Australia. It did, however, increase his public profile. Ayik became part of a wider story about organized crime adapting to encrypted technology and law enforcement, using that same technology against criminal networks. In November 2023, Turkish authorities arrested Ayik in Istanbul. The arrest was part of a larger operation targeting an alleged international organized crime group. Several dozen people were detained. Turkish officials accused the group of drug trafficking, money laundering, and other serious offenses. Ayik was reported to be among the central figures detained during the operation. His arrest did not automatically resolve the Australian case. A person arrested overseas may face local charges first. If the country holding that person decides to prosecute, extradition can be delayed or may not happen at all. By 2025, Ayik remained in custody in Türkiye. Reporting indicated that he could face a very long prison sentence there. It also raised the possibility that he may never be extradited to Australia. That position shows why international fugitive cases are complex. A person can be wanted in Australia, arrested overseas, and still not immediately appear in an Australian court. Ayik's move from Sydney, crime reporting to international fugitive status, depended on several factors. His departure from Australia, his years overseas, Türkiye's role, the ANOM investigation, and the later Turkish operation that placed him in custody. His case shows how organized crime investigations can extend beyond national borders once suspects, money, communications, and legal proceedings move offshore. Operation Ironside was one of the largest organized crime investigations ever announced in Australia. The operation centered on an encrypted messaging app used by alleged criminal networks. Users believed the app allowed them to communicate securely. Police later revealed that the platform had been controlled by law enforcement. The app was not marketed to ordinary users. It was circulated inside criminal circles through trusted contacts. Phones containing N0M were distributed to people who wanted secure communication for illegal activity. The attraction was simple. Users believed their messages could not be read by police. That belief was wrong. Messages sent through MM were accessible to investigators. Police used those communications to monitor alleged criminal activity in real time and to gather evidence about drug trafficking, money movements, firearms, and planned violence. In Australia, the operation was run by the Australian Federal Police under the name Operation Ironside. Internationally, the operation involved cooperation with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies. The scale was large. Police said the operation led to hundreds of arrests, many charges, and major seizures of drugs, cash, firearms, luxury items, and other assets. It also disrupted alleged criminal networks operating across Australia and overseas. The key feature of ANOM was not only that police intercepted messages. The stronger point was that alleged criminal users placed trust in the platform themselves. They wrote messages believing they were protected. They discussed shipments, payments, logistics, threats, and criminal plans on a system that police could access. That made the evidence different from traditional surveillance. Police did not only watch people meet, they could read communications between alleged offenders. They could identify contacts, routes, quantities, prices, and planned movements. This changed the way investigators approached organized crime. Traditional investigations often depend on physical surveillance, informants, phone taps, financial records, and seized material. ANOM gave police access to conversations that users believed were private, that allowed investigators to map networks more quickly. Hakan Ayik became part of the public story because police said he helped the app gain credibility. He was not presented as someone knowingly working with law enforcement. Police said he promoted or recommended the app without knowing it was compromised. That allegation made his reputation relevant. In organized crime circles, trust is often built through personal connections. If a known figure uses a device or recommends a platform, others may be more likely to accept it. Police said that happened with N0M. Ayik was wanted by Australian authorities at the time. He was overseas and outside the direct reach of Australian police, but his alleged role in spreading the app placed his name at the center of the operation. The N0M strategy relied on access and distribution. Law enforcement had access to the platform. The remaining challenge was getting alleged criminal users to adopt it. That required the app to appear credible inside the underworld. Once the app spread, police could collect communications at scale. This is why Operation Ironside received major public attention. It showed that encrypted communication, often seen as a strength for organized crime, could also become a weakness if the platform itself was controlled by investigators. The operation also showed how criminal networks had changed. Organized crime was no longer limited to face-to-face meetings, cash exchanges, and local contacts. Networks were using encrypted phones, offshore contacts, coded messages, and cross-border supply chains. ANOM gave investigators a direct view into that environment. The police response was coordinated. Raids took place across Australia. Officers targeted homes, businesses, vehicles, and other locations connected to alleged criminal activity. Arrests were made in several states. The charges covered a range of alleged offenses. These included drug supply, conspiracy, weapons offenses, money laundering, and other organized crime activity. In some cases, police said they were able to intervene before violence occurred. Operation Ironside also had a public messaging function. Authorities wanted criminal networks to understand that encrypted technology was not automatically safe. The announcement showed that police could adapt to digital methods used by organized crime. For alleged criminal users, the damage was broader than one arrest or one shipment. The exposure of N0M created distrust. If one encrypted app could be controlled by police, then other platforms could also be questioned. That uncertainty affected how criminal groups viewed digital communication. For Ayik, the operation changed his public profile. Before he was mainly known as a wanted Australian fugitive linked to drug allegations and organized crime reporting. After Operation Ironside, his name became connected to a global law enforcement strategy. Police said his influence helped the app spread. That claim did not bring him before an Australian court. It did, however, make him a central figure in the public explanation of how ANOM reached alleged criminal users. Operation Ironside remains important because it changed the relationship between organized crime and encrypted communication. The same technology used to avoid police became part of the evidence-gathering process. Hakan Ayik's role in the ANOM story was not based on a claim that he worked with police. Police did not present him as a cooperating witness. They did not say he knowingly assisted Operation Ironside. The public claim was different. Ayik allegedly helped the app spread because he believed it was secure. That point is central to how his name became tied to the operation. At the time, Ayik was wanted by Australian authorities and living outside the country. He was also known in organized crime reporting that made his reputation useful inside the criminal environment wherein 0M phones were being circulated. Police said Ayik recommended or promoted the app to criminal contacts. Because he was trusted by some people in those circles, others were more likely to use it. The app's growth depended on that kind of trust, and 0M was not available through a normal app store. It was placed on modified phones and passed through private channels. Users had to believe the device was safe before discussing serious criminal matters on it. Ayik's alleged involvement helped solve that problem for the people behind the operation. His role, as described by police, was not technical. He was not accused in public reporting of building the app or controlling the platform. His value was reputational. He helped make 0M appear legitimate to the people police wanted to monitor. This created an unusual situation. A fugitive wanted by Australian police allegedly helped drive users toward a system controlled by law enforcement. The people using the app believed they were avoiding police scrutiny. Instead, their messages were being accessed by investigators. This is why Ayik became a key name in public reporting about Operation Ironside. The operation itself involved the Australian Federal Police, the FBI, and other international partners. Many users were arrested after police analyzed communications sent through the app, but Ayik's name was used to explain how 0M entered criminal networks in the first place. That does not mean every 0M user adopted the app because of him. The platform spread through multiple contacts and networks. Police referred to Ayik because his profile helped explain the credibility of the app in organized crime circles. His case also showed how reputation can work against criminal groups. In organized crime, trust is usually built through personal links. People rely on names, introductions, and recommendations. ANOM used that same process. Once trusted figures treated the app as secure, others followed. Ayik's alleged role became important because it linked human trust with digital surveillance. He was not arrested in Australia after Operation Ironside was announced. He remained overseas until Turkish authorities detained him in Istanbul in 2023. By that stage, his public profile had expanded beyond the original NSW drug allegations. He was now linked to 3 separate issues: fugitive status, an EM distribution, and an alleged international organized crime group in Türkiye. The AN0 narrative made Ayik more than a wanted man in Australian reporting. It made him part of the explanation for how police gained access to communications inside criminal networks. Türkiye became a central location in the Hakan Ayik case after years of reporting placed him outside Australia. Ayik was wanted in New South Wales over alleged drug supply offenses. He was also linked in Australian reporting to the Comanchero bikie environment. While he remained overseas, Australian authorities could not arrest him directly. Istanbul later became the main focus. Reporting from ABC described Ayik, his cousin Hakan Little Huxarif, and Melbourne bikie Hasan Topal as established members of what had been dubbed the Aussie Cartel based in Türkiye. The same reporting said the men had been accused by Turkish police of major drug importations to Australia from their base overseas. The term Aussie Cartel should be treated as a media and law enforcement label. It does not mean every allegation against each person has been proven in court. The reporting placed Ayik inside a group of Australian-linked crime figures operating from Türkiye. This was important because it moved the story beyond a single fugitive case. It suggested a wider network involving drug allegations, money movement, and international contacts. Türkiye was not only a hiding place in the public narrative, it was described as an operating base. Ayik had been reported as living there for years. Some reports described a visible lifestyle, including hotels, cars, businesses, and public social media posts. ABC reported in 2025 that large parts of his wealth had been seized by Turkish authorities while he faced alleged drug and money laundering offenses there. That public profile created a contrast. Ayik was wanted in Australia, but he was not reported as living quietly or anonymously. His name appeared in stories about luxury, offshore networks, and Australian fugitives based in Istanbul. The Turkish case later became more serious. In November 2023, Turkish authorities arrested Ayik in Istanbul alongside 36 others allegedly involved in an international organized crime ring. Turkish Interior Minister Ali Yerlikaya said Ayik was detained after a raid and alleged he was involved in drug trafficking, manslaughter, looting, and money laundering. Reuters also reported that Turkish authorities described the operation as targeting an armed motorcycle gang, the Comanchero, which Turkish officials alleged was involved in drug trafficking and money laundering globally. The arrest placed Ayik in custody in Türkiye, not Australia. That matters because Australian charges and Turkish proceedings are separate. A person wanted in Australia can still face prosecution in the country where they are arrested. If that country has its own allegations, its legal process may come first. By 2025, Ayik remained in a Turkish prison. ABC reported that he was facing a potential sentence of 262 years in Türkiye over alleged drug crimes and money laundering offenses. The same report noted that he may never face proceedings in Australia because of Turkish extradition laws. This made the case more complicated for Australian authorities. The Australian interest in Ayik did not disappear after his arrest, but custody in Türkiye meant the next steps depended on Turkish courts, Turkish prosecutors, and local law. The Aussie Cartel reporting also connected Ayik to a wider issue. Australian crime figures using overseas locations to avoid arrest, manage networks, or continue alleged activity beyond Australia's borders. This is not unique to Ayik. Organized crime investigations often involve offshore movement. Suspects may hold foreign citizenship, use family connections, operate through associates, or shift money and communications across jurisdictions. In Ayik's case, Türkiye became the point where those issues came together. He was wanted in Australia. He was named in the ANOM story. He was arrested by Turkish authorities. He then became part of a Turkish prosecution involving allegations of drug trafficking and money laundering. The public record does not support treating all allegations as proven. The accurate position is that Ayik has been accused in Türkiye, remains linked to Australian organized crime reporting, and faces unresolved questions about whether he will ever be returned to Australia. In November 2023, Turkish authorities arrested Hakan Ayik in Istanbul. The arrest was part of a wider operation targeting an alleged international organized crime group. Ayik was detained alongside dozens of others. Turkish officials said 37 people were arrested during the raids. The operation was announced by Turkish Interior Minister Ali Yerlikaya. Turkish authorities alleged the group was involved in drug trafficking, money laundering, manslaughter, looting, and other serious offenses. Ayik was one of the most high-profile names detained. At the time, he had been wanted in Australia for years over alleged large commercial drug supply. He was also known internationally because of his reported role in the spread of ANOM, the encrypted app used during Operation Ironside. The Istanbul arrest did not come through Australian police directly arresting him. It was carried out by Turkish authorities under Turkish law. That point is important for the legal position. Once Ayik was arrested in Türkiye, the immediate process was no longer controlled by Australian courts. Turkish prosecutors and Turkish police had their own allegations to deal with first. The arrests were linked by Turkish officials to an alleged organized crime group with Australian connections. Some reporting referred to the group as part of the so-called Aussie Cartel. That term should be understood as a media and law enforcement label, not a court finding against every person named. Turkish authorities alleged the group used international routes and criminal networks to move drugs and launder money. They also alleged connections to motorcycle gang activity. For Australian authorities, the arrest was still a major development. Ayik had remained outside Australia for years. His arrest meant he was finally in custody, even if not in Australian custody. It also gave police and prosecutors a clearer position than before. He was no longer only a fugitive believed to be overseas. He was detained and facing proceedings in Türkiye. The case then shifted to legal questions about where he would be prosecuted and whether he could ever be returned to Australia. Australia had long-standing interest in Ayik because of the New South Wales drug allegations. But Türkiye also had its own case. When a person is arrested overseas on local allegations, the local prosecution can take priority. That is what made the case complicated. Ayik's arrest did not automatically mean extradition. Reports later indicated that he could face a lengthy prison sentence in Türkiye. ABC reported in 2025 that he could face up to 262 years in prison if convicted of the Turkish allegations. The same reporting raised doubts about whether he would ever be extradited to Australia. The reason involved Turkish extradition law and his position in Türkiye. A wanted person can be sought by Australia, but another country is not required to hand that person over immediately, especially if local charges are pending or if domestic law prevents extradition. For viewers, the arrest marked a turning point but not a conclusion. Ayik was no longer living outside custody. He was detained in Istanbul. Turkish authorities had accused him and others of serious organized crime offenses. Australian authorities still had separate interest in him. The 2023 arrest therefore changed the case from a fugitive file into a cross-border legal matter. It involved Australian allegations, Turkish charges, international policing, and unresolved extradition questions. Hakan Ayik's arrest in Türkiye did not mean he would be sent back to Australia. Extradition is a legal process. It depends on the law of the country holding the person, any treaty arrangements, the person's citizenship, and whether local charges are already before the courts. Ayik is wanted in New South Wales over alleged large commercial drug supply. Australian authorities have had an interest in him for years, but after his arrest in Istanbul in 2023, the immediate legal process was in Türkiye, not Australia. Turkish authorities accused Ayik and others of involvement in an alleged international organized crime group. The allegations included drug trafficking, money laundering, manslaughter, and other offenses. Turkish officials said 37 people were arrested during the operation. That local case affects any possible return to Australia. If Türkiye prosecutes Ayik first, Australian proceedings may be delayed. A country holding a suspect is generally not required to surrender that person while its own charges are unresolved. There is also the citizenship issue. Public reporting has raised doubts about whether Ayik can be extradited to Australia under Turkish law. ABC reported in 2025 that Ayik may never face justice in Australia because of Turkish extradition laws. While he was facing a potential sentence of 262 years in Türkiye over alleged drug crimes and money laundering offenses, that does not mean Australia has no interest in the case. It means Australia's ability to bring him back depends on legal conditions outside Australian control. A wanted notice in New South Wales is not the same as custody in New South Wales. Australian police can provide information, liaise with foreign agencies, and support international investigations. But once a suspect is detained overseas, the process moves through foreign courts and local prosecutors. Ayik's case also sits within a wider pattern. Some Australian crime figures have been reported as living overseas while facing allegations or investigations at home. Türkiye, the Middle East and other jurisdictions have appeared in reporting about Australian organized crime figures operating beyond Australian borders. That creates a practical challenge for police. Investigators may know where a person is. They may have allegations ready. They may have a warrant. But if the person is in a country that will not extradite, or if that country decides to prosecute first, the Australian case can remain unresolved. The result is a split legal position. In Australia, Ayik remains a wanted man linked to serious drug allegations. In Türkiye, he is an accused person facing local proceedings connected to an alleged organized crime group. Those are separate legal tracks. The Turkish case may produce its own trial, sentence, or appeal process. If that happens, it could take years before any extradition question is reconsidered. The length of any Turkish sentence would also matter. A long sentence in Türkiye could mean Ayik remains there for a substantial period even if Australia continues to seek him. There is also a political and diplomatic layer. Extradition cases can involve government departments, courts, prosecutors, and police agencies in more than one country. They are not handled only by investigators. Legal standards, citizenship rules, human rights arguments, and local prosecution priorities can all affect the outcome. For viewers, the main point is straightforward. Ayik's arrest was a major development, but it was not the same as an Australian prosecution. He was not placed before a New South Wales court. He was detained by Turkish authorities and placed into the Turkish legal system. That is why the case remains unresolved from an Australian perspective. Police may have wanted him for years. His name may be linked to Operation Ironside and a Nero meme. He may be accused in Türkiye of serious organized crime offenses. But until he is extradited or separately prosecuted in Australia, the Australian allegations remain outside an Australian courtroom. The difficulty is not only finding him. The difficulty is moving him from one legal system to another. The Hakan Ayik case affected Australian organized crime reporting in two main areas: encrypted communication and offshore criminal networks. The first impact came through ANOM. Before Operation Ironside, encrypted phones were widely treated as a protection tool for criminal groups. They were used to discuss drug shipments, money transfers, weapons, and meetings. Users believed the messages were hidden from police, and 0M changed that assumption. The app gave investigators access to communications between alleged criminal users. Police were able to read messages, identify contacts, track movements, and connect people to alleged criminal activity that affected criminal networks across Australia. Operation Ironside led to arrests, charges, drug seizures, cash seizures, firearm seizures, and the disruption of alleged crime groups. It also showed that encrypted technology could become evidence if the platform itself was compromised. For organized crime groups, the damage was not limited to people arrested during the operation. The exposure of ANOM created distrust around encrypted communication. If one platform could be controlled by police, other platforms could also be questioned. That uncertainty affects how groups communicate, how they approve contacts, and how they manage risk. The second impact involved offshore figures. Ayik was outside Australia when his name became linked to Operation Ironside. He was later arrested in Türkiye. His case showed that Australian organized crime was not limited to people living inside Australia. Police and media reporting have increasingly focused on Australian-linked figures operating from overseas. These figures may use foreign residency, citizenship, family connections, business fronts, encrypted communication, and international supply routes. This creates a more difficult enforcement environment. Australian police can investigate local networks, but alleged organizers may be in another country. Messages may cross borders. Money may move through several jurisdictions. Drugs may be arranged offshore before arriving in Australia. Ayik's case placed those issues in public view. He was wanted in New South Wales, linked in reporting to the Comanchero environment, connected to the ANOM story, and later arrested in Türkiye during an operation targeting an alleged international organized crime group. That sequence showed how one Australian fugitive could become relevant to several investigations across different countries. The case also affected public understanding of organized crime. Older crime reporting often focused on local violence, bikie clubhouses, street-level drug supply, or visible gang disputes. The Ayik case showed a different model: encrypted apps, offshore coordination, international police cooperation, and legal barriers to extradition. For law enforcement, the case reinforced the value of intelligence sharing. Operation Ironside involved Australian and international agencies. The Turkish arrest also showed the importance of foreign police action when a suspect is outside Australia. No single agency can control every part of a case once suspects, money, and communications move offshore. The case also sent a message to alleged criminal networks. A person can be wanted in Australia and still remain overseas for years. But distance does not remove law enforcement interest. Foreign authorities can act, communications can be monitored, assets can be seized, local charges can still be laid in another country. From an Australian perspective, Ayik's case did not close every legal issue. He has not been returned to face the New South Wales allegations. His Turkish proceedings remain separate from the Australian interest in him. Extradition remains uncertain, but the broader impact is clear. Operation Ironside weakened trust in encrypted criminal communication. The Türkiye arrest showed that offshore figures are still vulnerable to foreign police action. The Aussie Cartel reporting highlighted how Australian-linked crime networks can operate outside the country. For Australian organized crime, the lesson was practical. Technology can expose as much as it protects. Offshore movement can delay prosecution, but it does not guarantee safety. Reputation can help criminal networks build trust, but it can also attract police attention. The Hakan Ayik case attracted public attention in Australia for several reasons. The first reason was his fugitive status. Ayik was wanted in New South Wales over alleged large commercial drug supply. For years, he remained outside Australia. That made the case different from a standard domestic prosecution. The public saw a wanted Australian crime figure living beyond the immediate reach of Australian police. The second reason was his public profile. Ayik was not an unknown suspect. Media reports had already linked him to organized crime, the Comanchero environment, and overseas criminal networks. His nickname Big Hucks also appeared in Australian crime reporting. The third reason was the online image connected to him. Some media reports referred to Ayik as the Facebook gangster because of images showing an expensive lifestyle while he was overseas. That created public interest because it appeared to show a wanted man living openly while Australian authorities were still pursuing him. The fourth reason was ANOM. Operation Ironside was a major police operation. The public learned that alleged criminal users had trusted an encrypted app that was controlled by law enforcement. Ayik's name became part of that story because police said he unknowingly helped the app gain credibility among criminal contacts. That detail made the case more widely discussed. It showed a fugitive wanted by police becoming part of a police operation without allegedly knowing it. For many viewers, that was the most unusual part of the case. The fifth reason was the international setting. Ayik was not arrested in Sydney or Melbourne. He was arrested in Istanbul by Turkish authorities. That placed the case inside a wider issue involving Australian fugitives, foreign police, extradition law, and alleged offshore crime networks. The sixth reason was uncertainty. Even after his arrest, it remained unclear whether he would be returned to Australia. Turkish authorities had their own allegations. Australian police still had separate interest in him. The public case remained unresolved from an Australian legal perspective. This uncertainty kept the story active. People followed the case not only because of the allegations, but because the outcome was not straightforward. Ayik could face prosecution in Türkiye. He could remain there for years. He might never be extradited to Australia. The case also reflected broader public concern about organized crime. It involved alleged drug supply, bikie-linked reporting, encrypted phones, international police cooperation, money laundering allegations, and questions about how crime figures operate outside Australia. For Australian viewers, the case raised a practical question. Can a wanted figure leave the country, live overseas, become linked to global crime reporting, and still avoid appearing in an Australian court? That question remains one reason the case continues to attract attention. The Hakan Ayik case remains important because it brings together several issues in modern organized crime. It involves a wanted Australian fugitive, alleged drug supply, reported bikie links, encrypted communications, international policing, and unresolved extradition questions. Ayik was wanted in New South Wales over alleged large commercial drug supply. He remained outside Australia for years and was later arrested in Türkiye during an operation targeting an alleged international organized crime group. His name also became linked to N0M after police said he unknowingly helped the encrypted app gain trust among alleged criminal users. That app later became central to Operation Ironside, one of the largest organized crime investigations announced in Australia. The case shows how organized crime has changed. It is no longer limited to local meetings, local gangs, or local drug markets. It can involve encrypted phones, overseas bases, foreign citizenship, money laundering allegations, and legal processes across several countries. It also shows the limits of Australian law enforcement. Police can identify a wanted person. They can work with international partners. They can support overseas investigations. But when a suspect is arrested in another country, Australian authorities do not control the entire process. In Ayik's case, Türkiye has its own allegations. That means any Australian prosecution depends on legal decisions outside Australia. The lesson is practical. Technology can help criminal networks communicate, but it can also create evidence. Offshore movement can delay arrest, but it does not remove risk. Reputation can help a person gain trust, but it can also make that person more visible to police. For the public, the case raises a wider question about organized crime in Australia. If alleged criminal figures can operate from overseas, use encrypted communication, and stay outside Australian courts for years, how should police respond? And for viewers of this channel, there is another question. Do you think Hakan Ayik should be extradited to Australia to face the New South Wales allegations? Or should Türkiye prosecute him first under its own case? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you want more fact-based True Crime Australia reports, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.